Ladies and gentlemen, guys and girls, welcome to another episode of the Age of Warfare podcast. I am Angelus Maximus. There is the gate Ethan Cordier, who is not showing his face today because he has some major construction done in his house. But he's here. He could hear us, and we could hear him.
I'm here.
And today,
I'm here. Yeah.
Yep, and today we are talking about a fun topic, the Napoleonic Era. Yeah, we're talking about Napoleon, yes, the Napoleon Bonaparte, and we're talking about that small little era in West European history, and it's actually one of my favorite parts of history because of a game called Cossacks that we'll touch on in a minute. But before we get started, as always, how are we doing today, Mr. Aiden?
I'm doing really well. As Angel mentioned, we're having our kitchen torn out. It is currently an empty shell with breeze blocks and a bit of plasterboard at the moment. So the kitchen's in the living room, hence camera being off as well. But apart from that, everything's ticking along. It's been trying to write, but it's only notes at the moment because obviously getting to my computer's been a bit of a hassle. But apart from that, everything's sort of ticking along. It's going a lot smoother than I thought it would, put it that way.
Okay, very good. Before we get started, I wanted to just point something out that unfortunately we were supposed to do the next part of Philip II, but unfortunately Lee Edwards is not here. She's with his daughter, and unfortunately her condition is getting worse. He's in the hospital, and he's going to be in the hospital until further notice to we see what happens with his daughter. So we want to send him our best wishes and hope that his daughter gets better. He also has a GoFundMe as well that we'll mention at the end of the show. So, Lee Edwards, if you're watching, best wishes to you and your daughter, and we hope to see you come back soon. But right now, the Alexander the Great topic would be put on hold until he's able to come back, since it was his idea, and we want to give him credit for it, and we want him to be here to do it with us. All right, so now that we got that out of the way, and best wishes to you, Lee. All right, so Aiden, this was a topic Aiden came up with, and I can't blame him. This is a really fun topic, and he was asking me, why do we not talk about Napoleon's or this era so much in history? And why do you think that is, Aiden?
So one of the things, and it was, if you go into sort of history groups and things where they just talk about general chats, I mean, there's plenty on Facebook and Reddit. Occasionally you'll get the topic of, is the Napoleonic Wars a world war that comes up? And I was considering this topic. I was doing a bit of research on Napoleonic Wars because got a new War Games rulebook, and I was looking through it. I thought I did a bit of research, and the question struck me of that. And I had a bit more of a think about it because one of the things is with a world war is either it encompasses everyone, so everyone is brought in at some stage, or it takes place in more places. So the difference between the First World War and the Second World War. First World War was mainly Europe, North Africa. There was a lot of stuff going on in the Far East, but it was minimal comparatively. Second World War, obviously, the warfare was everywhere. There were certain places where it wasn't major. So, for example, South America, but they were still involved to a certain extent politically. Obviously, all the North American countries had prominent parts to play. Mexico, US, Canada, obviously. Europe, obviously, the whole of Europe. Russia, China and Japan have been at war since 1936. You have the whole Pacific War. So the whole world gets brought in. And then Africa as well. There was conflicts all over Africa to do with it. So we think of that as a world war. And then the First World War, you think, well, why isn't that? Why is that called a world war? Well, I think it was the end of the empires. So all of those countries in Africa, India is a prominent one, even in the Second World War, that they were part of the big belligerents. And one of the big reasons for the start of the First World War was because of the empires clashing. So all the countries were brought in by proxy while the warfare was in Europe. Now, when you look at the Napoleonic era, that's really at the start of what we think of as the big imperial period. So if you look at, when people talk about the British Empire, for example, you think of the Victorian era. You guy going off on safari. India is a classic example of that, where there's a lot of images. But obviously, that imperial era went back a lot further to slightly separate from the colonial era, which is where you get the settling of the US, things like that. That then settles into the imperial era when you get sort of the US War of Independence, like that, which is, you're talking sort of mid 1700s that's going on, and then that changes. What starts happening, especially when you've got the US Revolution, is that's not an isolated incident amongst that. Europe, even in the middle of the 1800s, goes through a similar thing as well.
Right.
But at this period, you get a lot of this going on. So obviously, you've had the French Revolution, which obviously impacts everything that's going on in the US, and obviously France and US rebellious forces at first, obviously, where they were connected. France was supplying them, and that's essentially how they won. They needed that support against Britain. France wanted to support them in a long-running war against Britain. So you think, well, that's quite worldwide. Britain obviously had most of its imperial territories by then. But when you really think about it, the warfare was kind of those were isolated conflicts to do with that. So Napoleonic Wars, you can add in things like the War of 1812, but we treat that as a separate conflict rather than being part of the major conflict. So it's almost like a world war, but not. It's just that all of the big powers were drawn in. And yeah, there were parts of it that were linked in the Far East as well. With China and India especially as well, because part of that was France, Britain, and the Netherlands, Dutch, various guises, all fighting over India and the territories around there. But that was more to do with the colonial, setting up the colonial era, than it was with this specific war. One of the big things is those big players then go on to form the empires. And the Napoleonic Wars shaped how all of that worked. One of the big things is the French Revolution, obviously. People talk about the French Revolution. And then they get to sort of where the Napoleonic Wars turn up. It's like, France turns into a republic. Napoleon comes along. And it's now an empire. It's under an emperor. It's a monarchy. You're thinking sort of a Roman Empire-esque thing going on, with a lot of influence from the Roman Empire. Because what did the French have on the top of their flagpoles? Well, they had eagles. They marched around with eagles on the top while they invaded the rest of Europe, trying to take over the country.
Yeah, eagle. Where have we heard eagles before?
Exactly.
The Roman Empire.
Right. So, and then obviously, with there being an emperor, there's a lot of this allusion to Italy as well. It's no secret as well that obviously Napoleon was a Corsican. He wasn't French as such, and he wasn't Italian.
Yeah,
Corsica
he was born in Corsica.
Separate. Yeah, and they were connected to obviously Italy through the northern one of the northern kingdoms. I can't remember off the top of my head. I want to say Naples, but I don't think it was.
Or Milan.
Yeah. So you've got this connection to Italy. Napoleon ends up putting his brother in charge of Italy as well at this time. So there's a big influence there. But what you have is it is a very European-centric war. However, everything that came out of that era is what shaped Europe, and what then brought about what then becomes later on the imperial era of this came up, and then people pushed for resources. Britain, with its colonies, hammering the colonies to try and get the resources, was directly because of this war. Britain didn't have the resources to do that unless it got that. Napoleon invaded Egypt and areas of the Middle East purely to stop Britain bringing in all of the resources from India that it needed as well. So you have this weird where it's sort of starting to get global at that time period, and the nations become set, and a lot of the influences of even down to the colors that you think of nations. Look, if you look at the colors of say you look at the World Cup, look at the colors of the shirts of the football teams. Those colors are almost all of them are directly related to the uniforms worn in the Napoleonic era. That was the color of that country, is that color. And that's when all of this starts. This national consciousness of this starts.
Yeah,
Really
like the
forming of
Netherlands is
who you are.
orange.
Exactly, and
Yeah.
that starts. That
And France is
started to
blue.
get. Yeah.
England is red.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And you have all of these that come out of it. I'm disappointed that Russia don't play in bottle green, but that's a different story. That was their Russian uniforms. It's in the Napoleonic period. One of the countries like to look at is Russia, because they had massive changes to their military
Yes.
leading up to the invasion by Napoleon. And a lot of the warfare that happens in the Napoleonic period with Russia, even around, it was up in Finland fighting against Sweden. So under major belligerents. And Sweden is another country I will get back to, because this was what made me think of this specific thing, of this influence. So they had the wars up there. And as we know, you get the Winter War just before the Second World War, where the Soviet Union is attacking Finland because it wants those lands back. Those lands were lands it gained during the Napoleonic Wars. These conflicts that you have going into the 1940s, the 1920s to 1940s, when you really think about it, Napoleonic Wars, though they ended in 1815 at the Battle of Waterloo. The settling of those, because they were so devastating, only really is like the 1830s that you get that. And then you get into all of the revolutions in the 1840s period. So it's really the people that fought in Napoleonic Wars would still come out and be dealing with those conflicts. But think about it, that's not that far from what was happening in the 1920s. It's only a 100-year period. Now, if you think about 100 years ago from today, you're talking about the same time frames, the 1920s. And if you look at how some of the international jokes, European international jokes, the 1920s and into the 1930s, especially, you've got that's all a lead up to World War II. And a lot of those jokes about the countries that we use these days and are brought up in papers to stoke a national consciousness are brought up from that, which is all brought up. Those ideas from that time period that we're bringing up were all thought up again. That's the Napoleonic period as well, that they're brought up because it was only over the previous 100 years that these countries started to form like we think of them today. And that formation process obviously takes until the mid 1800s, where you've still got the people who, you think about it, if you were fighting at the end of the Napoleonic Wars, say, not necessarily the 100 Days campaign with Waterloo, but realistically, it all tails off in early 1814 is really the end of it. So from that, if you were 20 in 1814, the revolutions that are happening in the 1840s are only 30 years later. You're 50. You're not particularly old. Those are the people who are the politicians of the time. They're the people who are the mayor, the upstanding member of the community. You think of general 50-year-olds that you know that have important places in the community. If you think about it from that time period, those people who set those countries, those were people who fought in those wars and came up with those ideas. So it's changed this whole national consciousness of Europe. But realistically, when you look at the Napoleonic Wars, people look at the French Revolution, and then you might get it brought up occasionally with the metric system. And then people skip over into the revolutions of the late 1800s. And everyone seems to skip this bit in the middle where all of this important stuff happened. And there are advances in warfare, but it was everything that went along with it. Because as we've discussed on several things, even in the Alexander one, is your national consciousness for most countries comes out of the fact that you're being pressured from another country is trying to invade you. So you need to rally around something. So you form an identity against. Well, if every country is being invaded, everyone's forming their national identity to bring up their troops because they're being invaded. So this is where you're really, really starting to solidify these ideas. So it's no surprise that when you get into the mid 1800s, you have all of these revolutions, because all the people who can move those revolutions on, all of those people in their 50s, are the people who were influenced by these ideas when they were younger. So I think that people just look at it as, because they're called Napoleonic Wars, they're like, oh, well, that's just wars. That's like looking at World War II and making a differentiation between well, the war part of it, and then all of the stuff that went along with it. Say the rise of the Soviet Union, the rise of Nazi Germany, rise of fascism in Spain and Italy, the changes within Britain due to the Blitz and the workers' rights changes. That's what people. It's like trying to make a differentiation between that, but they were both intrinsically linked together of being a set thing, but we seem to make this separation and people don't really know much about it. Oh, there's a bunch of people in coloured uniforms. Waterloo is the one that, oh, Waterloo.
Yeah, Waterloo, right.
People know about Waterloo, and quite frankly, it's because we've got a train station named after it in London, is one of the reasons. And then ABBA did that bloody song, which was about the train station. It's yeah. So, and that's, people know about it because of these weird circumstances that people know about it. But if you didn't have that, so if you hadn't heard of ABBA and you've never been to London, Waterloo is not something that you'd encounter as a thing as well. It's kind of like, say, if you talk about like people in Britain, we tend to know our history a little bit more. Smaller country, and we've got it all around us. People know about the history of, we know about this period of history with this castle because the castle was down the road next to their school. Whereas obviously, you ask people in the UK about any US history, it's going to be super modern that they know about. They're not going to be able to talk about in the Civil War, where you had battles that had two different names depending on if it was the South naming it or the North naming it. It had Manassas being Manassas or Bull Run. You got all of these different changes, and that's the thing. As someone who is a historian, that I know about, but your average person doesn't know about. And to me, it's very similar, but for everyone. It's our national consciousness. We should know more about Waterloo. In Britain, there was the Sharp series in the 90s. So a Bernard Cornwell series that was made into TV, and that was Sean Bean. That's where Sean Bean got his big on-screen break. It's one of the things that made him the most famous. And so people know about the 95th Rifles because that was the regiment he was part of. And people know about Waterloo because obviously you can't do Napoleonic Wars without Waterloo, it being the final battle. So people know about those if they've watched that. But that's a 90s series. And people, that's not like for the newer generations, especially, they don't have anything like that. The focus is on those time periods. If you talk to people about history now, it's easier to find someone who knows about Vikings as well, because we've got Vikings and Saxon stuff all over Netflix and Amazon. And I must admit, that's literally what I was doing before the podcast. I was watching the new season of Vikings Valhalla and going, oh, I know that guy. I know what he's about to do because I know what his name is. And it was really interesting to watch. But that if I didn't know about history, I would know. That's how I would know and be getting into history, which then takes us nicely into Cossacks.
Yes.
And learning about history from our modern sources are things that get younger people into history tend to be TV programs and computer games, and Cossacks being a prime computer game of our generation more. But, yeah.
I don't want to cut you off, but there was a couple of things I like about Cossacks. There was an encyclopedia, interactive encyclopedia, where they actually explained what each unit was and its history and all that, and even explain the history. Now, to be fair, when I played Cossacks 1, it touched upon the Napoleonic Era. It was kind of set within the period, right? When you advance to the 18th century, you remember all this, when you, and and the French, as the French, you could hire these King's Musketeers, and they were super OP, like they did 100 damage, but they had a very slow. So, but the funny thing is, the one game that the publisher actually made that I never got to play was Cossacks 2.
Cossacks 2 was a completely different game. So, Cossacks 1, you build your buildings, and then you build your units from the buildings. It's more like the old school Age of Empires, those types of games.
But there was and there was an expansion pack for Cossacks 2 that touched upon the Napoleonic Era.
Yeah, and I loved it because you could make your regiments out, because obviously that's how the system works. And one of the things you had to have is you had to have places that had your gunpowder and shot. And if you run out of that, your units couldn't fire anymore, and they would just stand there because they didn't have the ammunition. But it was all about capturing villages. It wasn't, you could build buildings, but it wasn't so much about. It was more about capturing areas than it was about building. So it's kind of lost that element, unfortunately. But it was nice to see them take the initial lead up to what became the Napoleonic Wars, because obviously there were a lot of wars before that, and then build that into the Napoleonic Wars itself. And with Cossacks 3 being essentially a remastered Cossacks 1, I'd love to see them do a remastered Cossacks 2.
Yeah, I honestly, or even better, use the same Cossacks 3, but set it in the Napoleon, Eric, or have a campaign set with Napoleon, have an actual campaign with, with the same Cossacks 3 engine. Because for me, listen, I tried Cossacks 2. It's just not for me. And it's not a bad game. It's just not for me. I definitely grew up with more of the Cossacks 1-3 experience. But that's where I got my introduction about European history. That's where I got my introduction, about those ages. I loved it. I played a heck out of those games when I was growing up.
This is a very important point. So I was chatting to my son earlier. My son is a very big gamer. He absolutely loves his games, and he'll play everything. And he played what was it? Assassin's Creed Valhalla and God of War as well. And from those games, he has a stupidly large knowledge about sort of the mystical side of the Vikings, all of their gods and what they do, and that historical side of things. So I can sit and talk to him about the Vikings on a slightly higher level, because those games have brought that to him. Obviously, with the Napoleonic Era, you don't really see this as much. I think part of it with the gaming is because unless you're into stuff like into PC gaming, you can't play a Cossacks or something like that, whereas console gaming is more. But also, on top of that, we don't really have it on television as well.
Yeah.
And it's
saying
that, we have literally just had a film about Napoleon.
Right.
Last year?
Last year, yes.
Yeah, I didn't go and see it. I was like, I might go and see it if it's still on when I've got a bit of money to go to the cinema. Didn't get around to it. Didn't stay in the cinema long enough. I haven't seen it go onto any streaming services. I'll probably watch it when it goes onto one. But it's, even I, with an interest in that era, the focus is on him, which, to be fair, is a good person to focus on. But it's focusing on that individual. It'd be like compare it to something like the Vikings, for example. With the Vikings, it's not just focused on one Viking and what they're doing. It's focused on a group of these important Vikings and what they're doing in different areas and how they're connected. With Napoleon, it would be interesting to see a Napoleonic era one done like the Vikings, and how these famous generals came up, which is how I'm going to get to talk about Bernadotte. Now, Bernadotte is a very interesting character. He started off French Revolution. He was I haven't looked deeply into it, but by all rights, he was the common man to start off with. He ends up fighting in the army because basically everyone did through the revolution. He then works his way up, and he eventually becomes one of the marshals of France, which is like becoming a 4-star general in modern parlance, what people understand. And from that, what people often forget is, going back to the Vikings, the Scandinavian countries controlled a lot. In the 1600s, you have Gustavus Adolphus, who essentially invented the modern cavalry charge as we think of it from the early to mid 1600s. But the 30 Years' War, which is so devastating to Europe, it's absolutely insane how devastating it is. Think Vietnam for the US, but dialed up to 11. And Vietnam was already about 10 and a half. And people were really struggling with that. But through that conflict, Sweden controlled Norway, Finland, Denmark, northern Germany, northern Poland, all around the edges of the Baltic states. Essentially, they were huge and very, very powerful. They ended up, by the Napoleonic period, they had Norway, Denmark, Finland, and this is obviously, there's technicalities of bits they didn't have and stuff, obviously, but just in general. They also had part of it around northern Poland. What we have in the area that we would think of as the Kaliningrad Oblast, if people know about that, obviously from the current war going on, it's sort of northeast of Poland, sort of stuck on the coast. Sweden couldn't put enough troops in there because through their various wars they ended up really struggling. So when the French invaded, they were like, no, we can't deal with this at all. So they surrendered, moved their troops out, and said, look, we're going to surrender this territory. There's nothing we can do against the army. Now, Bernadotte was the marshal who actually took that area for France. And he was like, well, this is very honourable. It's been done nicely. What's that? And he gave them incredibly favourable terms. Roll on a few years later, they end up losing their king. And then the next king comes in, and then a year later, they lose them. Through various, that sounds very medieval shuffling of kings and who's related to who, more 1600s level. But they end up needing a king, and they offer it to Bernadotte, partly because it keeps them close to France. So France doesn't invade them, take out Denmark, and put pressure on them while they really don't have an army. Part of this is fighting Russia in Finland. Now, one of the big things about this is Bernadotte ends up changing sides against France, allies with Russia when Russia gets invaded, ends up allying with Britain because it needs money for its army, various different things. Those wars surrounding that were the last wars that Sweden was actually part of. Sweden was part of World War I, it wasn't part of World War II, it hasn't been part of any other wars since. They're purely a defensive nation. Obviously, over the years, through various treaties, and around that time, especially Denmark and Norway become independent. Finland gets taken by Russia during that time period.
Russia, yes.
It ends up becoming independent. And then obviously everything happens in the Russian Empire. Obviously, Finland becoming Finland, and all of the other areas around the coast. You have Lithuania, all of Estonia, all of that around there. So you end up with Sweden just being Sweden. Now, the royal family of Sweden, to this day, is still descended from Bernadotte as well, and still follows that policy of we're a defensive nation purely. Now, that is something that happened in the Napoleonic period through the politics of the time, and is still held to this very day as well. And Switzerland was doing this not a huge amount beforehand. That was sort of more from the 1500s. That's 15 and 1600s with mercenaries as well. That's more to do with the 30 Years' War that they do this. But it's around this time that you get what we think of as Switzerland is neutral and Sweden's only ever going to defend itself and is massive on defense.
Right.
Decent enough military, but it's all about defense. This is the time period where those things become static. This is the same conflict where we really prove that the British Navy was the top navy. And it's not until our economic collapses because of the expense of the First and Second World War that you get, and then obviously the US needs to build a massive navy, being kind of isolated from everywhere the fighting's going on, that the US Navy then becomes the top navy through size and obviously various treaties for technology as well. Britain is still known as a naval nation, and that's one of the big reasons that we're known for that, is that time period. France is also obviously quite well known for its revolutionary antics, all to do with this time. But the biggest thing that we really need to talk about, so we're halfway through the episode, is the
Halberdier. Yes.
Yes,
it's actually one of my favorite units in Age of Empires 2 and 3. Before we get into the Halberdier, I don't know if you ever played Age of Empires 3. It's actually set in the colonial era. But I'm going to say this: Microsoft and the developer, they missed out they missed out on a big opportunity because when they made Age of Empires 3, you know, you had the original European nations of France, England, and they had expansions, which included the Chinese and American nations, you know, by Native American nations. But the one thing they didn't do was they never made an expansion pack with the Napoleon, you know, with what we're talking about, the Napoleon era.
Yeah.
Although there is a mod out there the Napoleon the Napoleon era, you know, but it's a non-commercial and fan-based modification, but it's a mod. So you know, if you're big into modding, yeah, which I you know, sometimes I use mods to enhance my games and, you know, give it a different experience. But it's kind of a shame that it took the fans to make, you know, to add into the Napoleon era. That's something Microsoft could have did themselves. And honestly, I think it might have helped with sales and might have helped with giving more exposure to Napoleon himself and all that.
Yes, this all centers around this point that we've been talking about, that it is in the modern time period. It's unless there's a TV program or a game about it, younger generations, because that's the medium that they're getting introduced to it, they don't see that. Now, if you go back to say the 70s and even into the 80s as well, and even up into the 90s, obviously I was brought up in a wargaming family. My dad did Napoleonic wargaming, which is why it was one of my first historical loves, the Napoleonic period. So I was brought up with that, and that's obviously a precursor to computer games of this type, was to play them on the tabletop, pushing your miniatures around, rolling dice. That's still a thing, and still thriving communities out there, and models being released constantly as we speak. So it's a period that people like, but you tend to only get older generations looking into it. And I think part of this is that obviously younger generations, it's on computers, and even as I think part of it in Britain as well. This goes into this, still on topic but slightly off the topic. It's a tangent.
Right. Mm-hmm.
The tabletop wargaming. So a lot of people know about Warhammer franchise, obviously. If anyone's got Prime, they'll have seen the advert. There's going to be a short on there, Henry Cavill. It's been a big thing. That has been since the 80s is when that started. Very fantasy based. That's all about tabletop wargaming, and that's generally where people get their introduction these days. Is that big? Essentially, it's the commercial one as well. Think of D&D being the tabletop role play game that you would play. But D&D, you've got the online versions that have been around for a very, very long time as well. And a lot of that has then been modified into things like World of Warcraft has a big crossover. And that's even had films. D&D has had films as well. So you get this, that's where people get introduced to these tabletop games. Right. Whereas partly in Britain it goes into the size of our houses. Tabletop wargaming is generally played on a 6 foot by 4 foot table. Trying to get a 6 foot by 4 foot table into a modern UK room is incredibly difficult. I have a 6 foot by 4 foot table. It's sat just over there, and it's a table that I built to sit on top of my dining room table, and I have to move around a lot of my living room to be able to get that table out. So it's a bigger effort than just turning your computer on and going and playing the computer. And that's just an effect of the modern age where we've got smaller houses and people consuming their media in a different way. It's kind of sad in a way, but it's times change type of thing. And there's still a thriving community of people who play tabletop war games. But that was the big introduction for a lot of the generations on Napoleonics. As well, because it was one of the big war game franchises. Because if you're doing a war game, you want big, colourful armies on your table because it just looks good. Napoleonic era is all about big, colourful armies. That's why people liked it. But you don't really get that as much. If you look at all of the films and the series, they come out in sort of the 80s and the 90s. Right. And they're all linked to that generation who was brought up on those types of games. Like, oh, I loved seeing these tabletop Napoleonic games. Oh, well, what about this? Bernard Cornwell being similar. And especially some of the ancients, the big ancients battles, same thing as well. But now it's very computerized that we do this. And there really isn't a Napoleonic era one And I think that's a big reason why it's not so much a thing that triggers in people's imaginations to go and study as such. Take another example.
Okay.
Archaeology in general, right? The
Yeah.
amount of people, when I did archaeology, that their introduction to archaeology was watching Time Team, because Time Team was a big thing. So we went, oh, that would be a cool, didn't realize it was a career that you could just go and do. So we went because of that. By the time I was doing my master's, it was started to become very difficult to get a job in forensics, because the popular TV shows at the time were all about forensic scientists. So everyone wanted to go and study forensics because it was an interesting thing that could get you a good job, and therefore people studied that.
Right.
With history, people go and study the things that they see about. You see, with the younger people coming into archaeology, so I went along with my career, you found a lot more people studying Saxons and Vikings, because that became the popular thing with games and TV programs.
Yeah,
so
right.
It influences people going into that as well.
I think the thing is, Aiden, I think back then, and it's kind of cost into modern society that Roman history and Greek history is just a sexier form of history. You know what I mean? It was the sexiest thing to go after. I say this because the Great Tutorial, my Roman series, did very well on Amazon in Roman history. You know, it broke out pretty well. So, you know, people love that kind of stuff. And you know, unfortunately, Napoleon tends to be undervalued, unfortunately, and it kind of sucks because he did do a whole lot. Now I wanted to move on to you were talking about the halberdier, the halberd. So
that came up. Napoleonic Era is where the halberds.
I want to show off what the halberd is to the audience.
Well, yeah.
This is what a halberd is for those who might not know what a halberdier carries. It's like a pike, but it's also got a sharp side, so not only can you poke like a pike, it goes a hack. You know, use it as a hacking weapon. You know, like the halberd was like the upgrade of the pike. You know, if you really want to, simplify things.
One of the things that you could bring up, if you can get an image up of the Swiss Guard, the Papal Swiss Guard, their uniforms come out of the 1600s, and the mercenary units for the 1600s became famous for using pikes and halberds, and they carried on with those uniforms. And it's the 1600s bit that starts this wearing brightly coloured uniforms.
Yeah,
and
I got it here. Okay. All right.
Yeah, there we are.
Yeah, right
so,
there.
And that's the 1600s.
Yeah.
So people,
I'm trying to get it. I'm trying to get a better screen. Give me a moment here. I'm trying to get a better look so everyone can get a better look at it.
While you're doing that, so the Swiss, I won't go into how the Swiss Confederation became a thing. They were mercenaries. They didn't really fight as a country. They would hire themselves out. And there were big wars between France and Germany. It was a dynastic.
Yeah, there goes a better look.
It's a better picture. Yep.
Yeah.
So, and that then led to these big regiments that were set of, you need to identify yourself as a mercenary company. Start getting these uniforms coming about. So think of like going even the way back into the proper medieval period, where a knight would have a surcoat with his coat of arms, and then he'd have his men wear those colours. That's where this comes out of these set colours. And then as you move on to have nations, this is where the set colours start to come in, because the army is of the nations, the colours. So the British red coat comes out of the 1600s, Cromwell's New Model Army. That red coat was first introduced under the New Model Army. And that then became the thing. Our first regiment of our modern army was the Coldstream Guards. Fun bit of history here. They fought in that war, and there was a whole load of stuff that went on with, we needed to disband our entire army because of the Civil War. So, but we obviously then still needed some soldiers. So they started to have a set army. So what they did was they disbanded everything, and the Coldstream Guards marched from Coldstream to London. They were put on the parade ground, and they were disbanded. They were disbanded by being told to place all of their weapons in front of them on the floor. They were then told to pick up their weapons, and therefore they were the first unit of the modern British Army, and that was 1660, I believe, or thereabouts. If anyone's listening who's connected to the Coldstream Guards, please feel free to connect me. I know I have I know people who've been in the Coldstream Guards, and they will readily correct you on that. But the point is, they started out that was our start of our army for our country that came out of our civil war. So these other countries are doing the same thing. So the papacy took theirs at the same period of time. The Swiss mercenaries, who just became the unit they had. Hello, Lee.
There goes our partner in crime, Lee. Yeah, he's watching.
Waving.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So you start to get these sort of set units that come in, and that halberd then becomes, during this time period, is when you're getting into the later 1600s, as you're getting the muskets in. So you're getting muskets and pike formations, but your sergeants are still using something called a spontoon, which is like a fleur-de-lis spear. It's a really weird way to describe it, but a spontoon. And then you also have halberds being a thing. This was actually a big thing with the Russian military. They were brought back under for palace guards, because, as you can see by the Papal Guard, they look damn good. Just like if you've got a couple of those guys stood outside your door, people are going to think twice about coming in there, mainly because they're probably going to take a few photos of them, so they look really cool. Now, the other thing about the Swiss Guard is that's a ceremonial uniform. So if you look at the British Army of nowadays, while our uniform is modified from the Napoleonic era, if you look at the trooping of the colour, which happens every year in front of the monarch, we have people wandering around, and they're still wearing red coats. The designs of those red coats are actually set in the 1800s during the colonial period, was when we moved away from the red coat. So they were then set as the traditional parade uniform for these events. So that was the last time we used them, really. So that became our set thing of our colour. But that then, as we said, has influenced various other things as well. Now, all of those units are modern soldiers as well. You see any photo of a British soldier out on the front lines that's from a guards unit, yeah, they're the same people wandering around in red coats. Those Papal Guards, you should, Adriel, after this, go and look up photos of their armoury. Oh my God, it's like watching John Wick. It's insane. They are essentially all equivalent of like SAS, Navy SEALs level type people. They are a proper security force, but they have these parade uniforms. Now, the thing with the Napoleonic era is everyone wore the parade uniforms on the battlefield because you were using muskets. And this only really starts changing a bit later on in this only really dies out in the 1860s as well. One of the reasons for this is the full introduction of everyone having rifles. Now, the US is a really good example of this with the US Civil War, of their weirdly basic uniforms from Napoleonic period, because you've got blue and grey. But when you really actually look into their better uniforms, you have the Zouaves in the US Civil War, and that was 100% a Napoleonic style uniform, really colourful, the red hats. So can you look up a picture of Zouaves to show people what we're talking about here? I don't know how to spell it. Let's see if I can do it actually. I have two hands. I don't have two hands at the moment, people. One of them is broken. There we are, image. Let's see if I can. Here we are. Here's a good image. Right. And now if this will... sorry, 2 seconds, people. Right. And if it will let me share my screen while I've got my camera off. Well, it says present. Share screen. Right. Share screen. And this one. It should come up there. There we are. So this was,
there we go.
That was the US Civil War. That's the 1860s that we're talking about here. And you got it's bright red trousers and blue. And now one of the other really important ones that we really need to look at, so I'm going to close that one down.
All right, close it. All right.
Give me a couple of seconds. I've got to use back buttons and things. Cavalry. French. Let's go for this year. Let's look at some of these images. Right, so this, if the image loads, all right, and if I press this button, right, so this is, sorry, it's my
technical difficulties.
yeah, sorry, give me a couple of seconds. This is, there we are. So when it comes up, this image.
Oh, yeah, that's beautiful.
That is nigh on what the French cavalry would have worn at the Battle of Waterloo. I mean, there are some significant differences that anyone who knows about uniforms of the period would be able to tell you. However, that photo is from 1914, and that's French cavalry going to attack the Germans that had machine guns. Now, when you really think about it, where those uniforms, obviously in the national consciousness and everything, we see these all throughout these other bits of history. And that's 1914 there. We're talking, that's 100 years after the Battle of Waterloo, that they're still wearing those uniforms. French uniforms of 1914. They come out of the Franco-Prussian War. So, and as well, ironically, that I showed you that, they are that similar uniform, those colours as well. And they developed out of these Napoleonic uniforms and what's the traditional dress of people's countries as well. The Greeks are a classic example of it. What the thing is, we see all of these things. We go, well, why were they wearing these colourful uniforms? And then people don't go, cool, this is an opportunity to delve back into the Napoleonic Wars and why everything was happening as well, this thing. And I notice we are just over 45 minutes in. So there is another 2 big things that we need to get into. And these are things that do come up with Napoleonic Wars. So as everyone knows, warfare isn't just about soldiers wandering around, marching around, doing all their things, guns, blowing things up, shooting each other. That's one part of warfare. Warfare has obviously got all of its other aspects. You have propaganda. This is a thing we know in the modern age with the internet. That's a much bigger thing. Vietnam was televised, being another important thing. But obviously, I had etchings back in the Napoleonic period. One of the other things that you have is obviously economic warfare. You put sanctions on a country to stop them doing things. You prevent their trade. Now, Britain, being a maritime nation, we were all about our trade. Our empire was about trade. It was about getting resources from one place to another to make us wealthy. I'm not going to go into the whole British Empire thing, but essentially our empire was based on the biggest trade network, which gave us the most control. Think of like the modern US, the massive impact upon the world economy that the US has and their trade, and how much power they have. They're not using that for warfare purposes. So they are, let's not get into that side of things, but it's that's what the British Empire was trying to do at the time, to be able to use that as control. So what France wanted to do was prevent that, because Britain was literally paying for all the other countries in Europe with that money to go and fight the French, because that's basically what we did. We were known as the paymasters of Europe at the time. So one of the things that France did was, it came out of the revolution, was changing up how they did things. Things like how they wrote law. So it's redoing law, because obviously previous law was based on, well, the feudal law that had come down. And that changes a lot of things. They then had that with their economy as well, where they had the continental system. And part of it was meant to be so it was incompatible with what we know as common law. So in the US is a common law country with torts. The basis of it is essentially in that, apart from Louisiana state law, because funnily enough, it was French. So it's based on these French laws. Of course, there's a few issues, obviously, but the basics of it, real basics, is in it's all about permissive and non-permissive. So if you write, so under a lot of common law is you're allowed to do everything unless your contract says you can't, right? Whereas under this continental system, the way that they did their contracts in Europe, the basis of that is the only things you can do are what's written in the contract. So you can't do anything unless the contract says you can do it, which is obviously opposite of things. So you then have to work where they're connected. So obviously everyone knows Brexit took a very long period of time, and there were issues with us trading with Europe and contracts. This is the basis of this, because our law and the way we do contracts is different from the way Europe does their law. It's why it was so convoluted, because obviously over the intervening 200 years, we kind of worked out how to make them kind of fit together. But the pure basis of the law creates that meant that we had a lot of entanglements within that, because there had to be a clause in this one that was linked to a clause in this one over here to make them work with each other. So untangling them then means that it cascades onto something else. You have to do it in the right order. This is why Brexit took so long. So it affected the modern world. And one of the big things with Brexit in the UK is whether you agreed with it or didn't agree with it, the length of time that it took to actually make it happen actually impacted the UK economy negatively. And this was a thing that both sides said would happen. It was just the amount that it would happen. The whole idea was to get it done quickly so that it wouldn't. However, when you really look at it, is because Napoleon changed the legal systems within Europe, because how much he conquered, to shut Britain out of a lot of trade, to make it very difficult for that trade to happen. And if Britain never isolated itself again, it would be so isolated, it'd be so difficult to get away from it or to join back in, to be near impossible. So Brexit happened, and then that thing still kicks in. Napoleon did that purposely to hurt British trade, and we saw the exact thing happening 200 years later. This is the impact that that period had on Europe, that it affects that. We then have the other thing that comes out of the Napoleonic Revolution, the French Revolution, then with Napoleon spreading around and picking and choosing, is the metric system. Now, the metric system, the irony of the US not using the metric system apart from science, and the UK using the metric system, we use both because we're weird, is utterly bizarre considering how close you were to the French when everyone was changing to the metric system. That has always confused me why that happens. However, the metric system itself was, weirdly, it's not that much different to the imperial systems that we have. So it's US customary units, which in the UK we have the imperial system. They're very similar. Essentially, where the US split from the UK, we had the same units, and then the US developed into customary units because it changed, and the imperial system changed as well. So they diverged. US and UK English. The divergence, they're kind of compatible, but there's some notable differences. Take the pint in the UK is 568 milliliters, whereas the pint in the US is decidedly not, and you guys are getting shortchanged. So you get these differences, and that as well is why if you look at Europe, Europe uses the metric system and not these imperial systems. The metric system grows out of a need of getting rid of the king's imperial system. You've just had a revolution to make yourself a republic. You want to change the system to something that you want. US goes, all right, cool, we're going to take what everyone's actually doing, and we'll just call it the US customary units. There's one way of doing it. France took that, changed it slightly, and because of the science of the time, went, cool, we're going to call it the metric system. We're going to make everything metric. And the only thing that didn't stick was metric time as well, because they changed time to metric. They changed the calendar. I think they named all of the months after flowers or something weird as well. So you have these big changes that have affected Europe. And obviously, through all of those, it's the metric system that stuck because it worked so well for the science they were doing at the time. Hence why every country in the world uses the metric system for science, even the US as well. So that impact that it had on the world. However, that wouldn't have spread to the point where it had that much impact if Napoleon hadn't grabbed that and gone wandering around Europe and going, well, you're using this now because it's going to really annoy the British. But you're using this now, it's going to really annoy the Russians, obviously, when it gets to Eastern Europe, to try and get them out of the way. So you have this, without the Napoleonic Wars, all of these ideas that we take for granted in Europe never really spread further than France. They would have just been, that's the French system rather than the European continental system. And it literally called the continental system, which is, those bits are brought up. So the metric system is obviously a big talking point if you go online. I do think one of the biggest parts of this is because we talked about media, we've talked about the metric system, we've talked about common law, or obviously the changes in law that Napoleon had done. Those aren't in the US. Now, if you look at where people are getting influenced by that to look into history, media in the current modern world is really controlled by US media as well. If you looked in the 1940s, you'd just as easily find something out of a British studio as you could from a US studio. But UK films are now quite rare. Series we still do okay on. We're doing quite well on that, especially comedy, because obviously different countries have different likes of comedies. But the US really wasn't involved in Napoleonic Wars. 1812 only came about because, as I said, we had a massive navy over here. We needed soldiers and sailors. So we did some dodgy stuff legally, and then the US did some other dodgy stuff legally, and then tried to invade Canada. And then the Canadians went, "We're not having this. Why don't we burn down the White House?" And it's like, well, you pissed off the Canadians. What do you expect, really?
Right.
But and half of them were French anyway, which is just bizarre. But so you end up with this situation of that's a separate thing, but that's a conflict that was directly influenced.
Yes.
However, it's Napoleonic Wars never really hit the US. You got a few people from the US, especially families that were holdouts from the War of Independence, because obviously that's still not that far back in this, moving over into British forces. You think Britain's fighting Napoleonic Wars in the 1780s and 90s. Well, I think that's not really that far. It's the children of the US Revolution and US War of Independence that are then those people. They had to go somewhere, and they came across to Europe. And then this doesn't even get into everything around your area, Angel, with Puerto Rico and all of the different things that happen within those colonial areas.
Correct.
And the revolutions that happened directly related to the French Revolution connections.
I know.
All of wars over the sugarcane as well. It's like, it's absolutely astonishing how much impact it had. But realistically, though, the actual Napoleonic Wars themselves, while they had all this impact, only really they were very European, because that's where all the fighting really was. I mean, obviously, you have Egypt, but they're very European. But it's that impact that goes around, and because it's not European media that's having the impact on younger generations, I think that's probably the biggest reason for it. It didn't affect more people, and I think it's also a good argument to why you can't really class it as a world war either, because if it was, you'd have more countries bringing up things about the Napoleonic period rather than just that time period in their own countries as well. So I think, it's one of those interesting. I just really want everyone to look at the Napoleonic period, because those uniforms are awesome. It's so pretty.
Yes.
Yeah.
But anyway, we've kind of reached the end here. We've almost to the hour. So, I mean, if there's any last points you want to get off, Aidan, go ahead.
One thing I'd say, if people comment when they watch this through again, please do. And also have a look at any connection that you have in your area, or anything that you can think that is Napoleonic that has any connection to you as well. And just see if there's anything that you can think about with that. And I'm willing to bet, especially for a lot of people in the US, there is very, very, very little that will come up. It's short of people from the Napoleonic period fighting in the US, which one of my ancestors also did. There we are. That's a weird one.
Wow.
I think he was actually stationed somewhere around your end of the world, actually, in one of the islands. Possibly even the British Virgin Islands, as we talked about before the podcast.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I would encourage people to have a bit of a look at the time period and actually see how much of it has influenced their lives and how much of it really directly connected as well. Like, go and read about history.
Yep. All right, guys, we have reached the hour. I mean, that was a great topic. Very fun. Very good idea to touch on a topic that just doesn't get enough attention. But I wanted to say that the hope is maybe in 2 weeks or so we can get back to the Alexander series we started. But I mean, right now, as I said earlier in the show, Nee is dealing with his daughter. She's not doing so well in the hospital. He's started a GoFundMe, so you can check out the donate. So if you want to send donations, I'm going to put the link in the comment section, so you can check that out. So we wish Nee the best, and hopefully he'll come back soon. But if not, we'll keep on entertaining you the best we can and continue to come up with as much topics as we can until that time comes. But consider donating to Nee. Nee is a wonderful guy, so consider donating. And the GoFundMe is doing pretty good. It's almost getting close to its goal. So so far it's doing pretty well. So I'm glad. I'm happy with all the support it's been getting. So, and also stay tuned for more updates about the charity anthology that we were doing with Nee. Got a bunch of awesome authors joining in as well. So hopefully the aim is to get that out for October before Halloween.
Yep.
So you could check that out. I'm just putting the links in everywhere. So yeah, we really want to get as much attention to this GoFundMe as possible. That way we can help out Nee and his daughter, and hopefully it all turns out for the best. But Nee is informed me he's ready for if the worst was to happen. He's ready if the worst is to happen. Hopefully not. So
yeah. So it's all
yeah.
Any support you can give in any which way you can, please.
Yeah, please. It would be well appreciated. So, of course, that means the programming on the Age of Warfare will be a bit of a priority. We hope to get back to the Alexander the Great. Hopefully, he comes back soon, but we're not pressuring him to do so. That's family first. So, whenever he comes back, he'll come back.
And Lee left us with a whole bunch of ideas as well, so we're not short of ideas. So
yep. So we'll be back in 2 weeks with a new idea. We're not sure what the idea is going to be yet, but you can bet that it'll be a wonderful, interesting topic. But until then, guys, this has been Angel. This has been Angelus Maximus. That has been the Gate, Aiden Cordier.
I'm waving even though you can't see.
And hopefully in 2 weeks everything will be okay with your house and we'll be able to see your handsome face again.
Possibly not. It's we've got another 2.5 weeks apparently. Well, wow. Yeah. They take a while.
Okay, well,
fingers crossed.
But fingers crossed. But he'll be here. He'll be around, and you'll be able to see my face anyway. So there you go. But anyway, guys, thank you for watching. And this will be up on YouTube later on, so you can check it out on YouTube on the Book of Simon podcast channel on YouTube. But until then, this has been Angelus Maximus. That's Aiden Konya, and we'll see you in 2 weeks. Until then, take care, guys.
Take care. Bye-bye.